Hello and welcome to this webinar for Wales Nature Week. This year's theme is Nature's Treasures. So we are taking this opportunity to celebrate red squirrels and their conservation in Wales. I'm Kay Hoare, Director of the UK Squirrel Accord Partnership, and I'm joined by Josie Bridges of the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales and Caro Collingwood of Red Squirrels Trust Wales. Aside from this webinar, there are lots of online and in-person events taking place this week and focusing on various different and wonderful aspects of nature. For more information, see the Wales Nature Week Twitter profile or search using the hashtag Wales Nature Week. In a minute, I'll hand over to our wonderful speakers, and then we'll hold a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. If you have any questions you wish to ask, please put them in the Q&A section of Zoom to enable us to keep track of them, and do use the chat function for any general discussions. So that said, our first speaker is Josie, so I will hand the screen sharing over to you.
Lovely, thanks Kate. Give me 1 second whilst we pass over the presentation. Right, can everyone see the presentation? Give us a nod, Kay, if you've got that on your screen.
Thanks, Josie.
Wonderful. Thank you ever so much, Kay, for that wonderful introduction. So as she said, my name is Josie Bridges, and I'm the ecologist for WITSU. And I also manage the Red Squirrel Project as part of my role. So WITSU is the Wildlife Trust of South and West Wales. We're one of 47 wildlife trusts in the UK, and we're actually the biggest out of the 5 in Wales. We cover a huge area, Aberystwyth all the way down to Cardiff, as you can see from the screen. And over that, we manage well over 100 nature reserves that are scattered all about the area, as well as working on lots of landscape scale projects outside of our land, of which the Red Squirrel Project is one, which we're going to chat about today. So WITSU works in partnership with our Mid Wales Red Squirrel Partnership. So they came together and were formed in 2002 when the local foresters in the area noticed that they were still seeing red squirrels. You know, for a long time we thought they were really extinct in this area. But because of the area that we work in, which I'll get into in a minute, it's very remote, it's very isolated. Not many people are up there, either walkers or people working there. So the red squirrel population there just clung on just out of the realm of what people knew. So yeah, in 2002, when they realised that there were still red squirrels in the area, this partnership came together. So we're made up of a lot of different people. We sort of host a partnership, the Wildlife Trust. We've got Powys and Carmarthenshire County Councils involved. We've got wildlife organisations such as Vincent Wildlife Trust, and then all of the foresters. So we've of course got Natural Resources Wales, and then we've got the private foresters such as Till Hill, Silviculture, Select 4, and then we also liaise with people such as BASC and GWCT, particularly on the grey squirrel control side of things. And this partnership has really helped us work at a landscape scale for our conservation, instead of just being isolated to our own land at the Wildlife Trust. So just some sort of context of where we are, map of Wales, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen. Yep, brilliant. Okay, so yeah, we work in this bottom area here, so sort of just south of Aberystwyth, Devil's Bridge area. What's really interesting is that you can see the Sitka spruce plantation forestry from the aerial scale map of Wales, which is gives you an idea of the scale that we work at down there. So this is just a bit of a zoomed in picture of it to see where we are. So just to orientate yourselves, we've got Aberystwyth up to the north here. We've got places like Devil's Bridge, Llangurrig, Rhayader, just sort of north of where we work. And then down to the south, we've got places like Llandovery and then the Brecon Beacons just off the map there. So we're really in the sort of heartland of the Cambrian Mountains, the sort of central spine of Wales. So it's pretty remote and it's pretty isolated, but it's good for the squirrels. So we have what we call our red squirrel focal zone and our red squirrel buffer zone. So the focal zone is denoted here in orange. And in this area, we only want to have red squirrels as part of our project. And then our blue buffer zone here around the outside is an area where we don't want to have any squirrels. So we do a lot of grey squirrel control in this intermediate area. The idea being is that we create a really safe barrier around our sort of precious red squirrels here in the middle. So we focus a lot of our monitoring work on the middle here, and then a lot of our control work on the outside. So you'll see from this picture, we've actually really excitingly just expanded our focal zone and our buffer zone. So the original focal zone is the solid line, and then these dashed zones here are areas that we're looking to expand our focal zone and our buffer zone into. So this has just been approved by the partnership and by Welsh Gov. We are now working at a bigger scale than we've worked at previously, which is really exciting. It means that we can include a lot more of these private woodlands here on the edge. So this is Longwood Community Woodland, which have been very helpful to the project over the years, and it's exciting for them that they're now within the buffer zone. And then we've got the Northern Towie section up here, which again is comprised of community woodlands and NRW forestry. And they've got an awful lot of squirrels up there, so it's really exciting that they're now officially part of the focal zone. There we go. This is just an aerial map showing the new focal zone and the new buffer zone. So just to give you some context, the focal zone is about 25 kilometres across and about 25 kilometres up and down as well. And that's just the focal zone. The Towie Forest, which is this sort of big section of continuous forestry here in the middle of the focal zone, that is over 6,000 hectares in size. So you can see the scale that we're sort of having to monitor across. And we don't have that many squirrels in this area. So it is somewhat like trying to find a needle in a haystack in this area, but we'll get a bit more into that in a minute. So within this area, our reds are facing similar threats to most of the other areas of the UK. The big one, of course, is grey squirrel incursion. Unfortunately, the area we work in can have grey squirrels enter from all sides, which makes control very difficult. The greys will outcompete the reds for food. Not only do they eat more, because they're much bigger animals than the native red squirrel, they pick clean the woods of food, so the red squirrels just get starved out essentially. But they can also eat acorns and hazelnuts and beech nuts before they're ripe, which means the reds don't have time to eat them. So the red squirrels can't tolerate eating nuts that aren't ripe, that are green. So by the time they're ripened, there's just none left for the reds to eat, unfortunately. Grey squirrels, of course, spread squirrel pox, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. That's the picture in the bottom right corner is of a red squirrel with squirrel pox. It's completely fatal for reds. Greys just carry it. It doesn't seem to affect them. But if a red squirrel has become infected with it, it's very unlikely that squirrel will survive. Interestingly, the pox itself doesn't kill the squirrel. It causes sores on the animal's eyes, ears, nose, throat, genitals. And what that means is that the squirrel just can't find food, and it essentially starves to death. Luckily, within our project, we don't have a huge problem with squirrel pox. This is mainly because our squirrels live at such low densities that there's very little squirrel-to-squirrel transmission. We also don't have many squirrel feeders out, so that also limits our risk of squirrel pox being transmitted. But it's always a worry for us. We're always concerned that we are going to get an incursion of this disease. But by far our biggest problem, as for most conservation, is habitat loss, both through the actual removal of trees and corridors, but also through the grey squirrels utilising what we would think of as prime squirrel habitat. Speaking of prime squirrel habitat, this is what we would think of as ideal habitat for red squirrels. Lovely mixed structure woodland, lots of old growth trees, a really nice hazel understory, which provides food for the animals, and lots of standing and fallen deadwood, which provides fungal bodies, which is a really important food source for reds over winter. But unfortunately, this is the habitat that most people now assume red squirrel needs, because red squirrels can only just sort of survive in this habitat. It's very wet, it's very mossy, it's mostly sick spruce plantation. All of the trees are very close together, it's very dark. And the reason that reds have survived here is because it's bad squirrel habitat. So it's bad for reds and it's bad for greys, but reds can only just survive here because they're a much smaller animal, they don't need as much food, and because greys just can't tolerate living in this sort of environment. So it creates this little sort of safe pocket for reds to sort of survive in and breed in. Now, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this video because it's going to be a bit laggy, but you might just have seen a red squirrel shoot across. So red squirrels eat, as I've talked about, a variety of things. They're vegetarian, but they eat sort of nuts, seeds, cones, sapwood. They eat fungal bodies in the winter, and they occasionally eat birds and birds' eggs at certain times of year. But in these Sitka spruce plantations, they survive almost entirely on Sitka spruce cones. So these are absolutely tiny. I don't know if you've ever had a walk in a Sitka woodland, but compared to our native Scots pine cones, they're much, much smaller. Their seeds are miniature and they have really, really low calorific value. And this creates a quite difficult dynamic for squirrel conservation because this isn't good habitat for squirrels. It isn't good food stuff. But if we try and improve the habitat for the reds, we'll also improve it for the greys. So we have to keep the habitat just bad enough that it dissuades the greys from entering, but it provides just enough food for the reds to survive. So it's a constant balancing act of how to improve habitat without improving it too much. As well as issues with habitat quality that we have here in this area, we also have issues with quantity. So this is a NRW map of the Towie Forest, which is our main area we work in. So our focal zone is sort of just extends beyond the edge of this map, but this is the Towie Forest, which is, yeah, as I say, NRW owned. So it's got one land manager, which is always helpful, and then we've got some bits of private forestry here around the bottom. So this is an aerial map showing the sort of same area. So focusing in on the top bit here, which is an area that's just come into our focal zone that we work in a lot. We have had some issues over the years with sort of habitat reduction and removal of corridors. Oh, is it going to load? There we go, there it is. So the difference, I'll just flick back because it was a bit laggy there. So this is a photograph from around about 2010, I believe, and then this is the photograph from 2020. So you can see the real difference in the tree cover that we've got here in the Northern Towie. So not only has this clearfell area completely expanded, but it's completely cut off what was this corridor of movement for squirrels. So corridors are so important for all of our species because they allow them to be more robust for population changes. They allow the squirrels to move if there's low food availability, and to have more denning opportunities, and most importantly, to find each other, to breed. So now we've essentially got this island of habitat up at the top here with very, very little connectivity with the rest of the forest. We know we've got red squirrels here. We also know we've got things like pine martens and crossbills and all sorts of other rare species. And they're now all quite isolated up in this top bit. We will be working with land managers in the future to replant this top corridor with squirrel suitable habitat. But that's, a long time coming. So these are some of the issues we face. Most of this felling was done through the new tree diseases that we've got coming out. So this was government ordered felling through the Phytophthora for the larch, and then also ash dieback. We had to have a lot removed from around the footpaths and trunk roads. So it's really unfortunate that it all happened in the same area. But we do work with our land managers to hopefully avoid situations like this. Oh, that's just another zoomed in copy of that. But it's obviously much easier to convince land managers of the importance of corridors if you know how many squirrels you have. And this is the biggest question that we face in this project. Because of the low amount of people we've got in the area, we have very few sightings that come into our project. These are actually some really beautiful photos that we got recently of red squirrels in the Northern Towie, which is always lovely to see. But normally our sightings are just people saying that they've seen a squirrel, which obviously isn't as helpful. Squirrels are sort of notoriously difficult to tell apart. You'd think that a red squirrel would be red and a grey squirrel would be grey, but it's not always that simple. These are two other photos that we've had in recently of people thinking they'd seen a red squirrel. The one on the left is from a trail camera and they thought it was a red because it's got this lovely sort of russety bit on its back. But this is a grey squirrel, it's got no ear tufts, it's got the halo around the tail, and it's just a big chunky animal compared to our reds. And then this other photo here was from a bird table, and again, beautiful russet red animal, but again, tail halo, and no ear tufts, and just really chunky looking animal. And also it's on a bird table. They're really cheeky, so grey squirrels tend to be more likely to come to where people are. So yeah, sightings aren't normally the most reliable for us, unfortunately. That we get minimal sightings in, and of the sightings we get in, very few are easy to verify as being real reds. So we do an awful lot of feeding cone surveys. So these are the Sitka spruce cones I was talking about earlier. So different animals eat different cones in different ways. So these are squirrel chewed cones because they look really scruffy. If a mouse has been chewing on a cone, it's very, very neat and tidy. And if a crossbill has been at it, then the individual tufts will be stripped. So you can tell which species has been at it. Unfortunately, you can't really tell a difference between grey squirrels and red squirrels with cone chewing. Although if it's in the centre of the Sitka spruce plantation, it's very unlikely to be a grey squirrel. But we do verify our cone searches with camera traps. Here's just some close-ups of feeding remains from our reds. Now, as I discussed earlier, the area that we work in is huge. So we can only cover a small area of it with feeding surveys. So we tend to focus them on areas that we've had historical records in and that are easy for volunteers to survey, which makes it a little bit biased, but with such a large area to survey, we can only do certain bits. And then, yeah, we have lots and lots of camera traps out. So hopefully you're seeing on the screen, it might be a little bit laggy, 4 red squirrels running off into the edge of the woodland there. Camera traps are wonderful. They really are. They provide us with a resource where we can not disturb the animals. We can cover a much wider area than we'd be able to cover on our own, and it's a really great engagement opportunity for volunteers as well. But unfortunately they can be a little bit biased because you can often get clips like this where you have 4 squirrels on a single clip, and it'd be very easy to assume from that we've got a good population, but this is likely to be a mum and some almost grown up offspring, or it could just be that we've got a bit of a honeypot situation here with lots of cones about, so they're sort of tolerating each other a lot more than they normally would. So although we use a lot of camera trapping, it's not a really good way to measure population dynamics within our population. Oh, we might even have sound on this one as well. So we also do an awful lot of live trapping. So we have a red squirrel license, which allows us to live trap our red squirrels. So you should see on the screen here a cage trap that's got a wooden box on the back for the reds to retreat into. So these are set overnight. So hopefully what happens is you put lots of peanuts and cob nuts inside, and cheeky little red squirrel comes up, steps on a treadle at the back, the door closes behind them, and then a few hours later we'll come and we can check the squirrel. So this is great because we know for sure it's a red squirrel, although it can be obviously quite stressful for the individual animal. So we do try to limit where we do this. But it also allows us to get DNA samples, hair samples. It allows us to weigh the animal. It allows us to sex the animal, and you can work out exactly how many animals you have trapped, because what we like to do to our squirrels is run them into these little handling cones here. I've trapped and handled an awful lot of wildlife in the UK, and squirrels are by far my least favourite to trap. They are very wiggly, they're very fast, and they're very, very bitey. So I would always rather try and handle a badger than a squirrel, which is why we put them in these cones, for their safety and for our safety. So yeah, you run them into the cone, you put a stick or a pen in between their legs so they can't wiggle back out, and then you can handle them sort of quite safely and health check them. We also microchip our squirrels. It's the same microchip as you put into a cat or a dog, and it allows us to scan them if and when we trap them again. And you can also get feeder boxes which can scan microchips as well as they come in and out of them. So what we do once we've trapped our squirrel is we put a little notch in their tail, such as this. This doesn't hurt the squirrel, it's just the fur, and it'll grow back out in about a year or so. And for each squirrel we trap, we put notches in different places, which means that when we get them on camera trap later on, we can match up the notch to the squirrel tail. So we know exactly which that individual is, because red squirrels are pretty tricky to tell apart. They're not like some of our other species that have got really defined characteristics between individuals. And as I say, you can tell whether they're male or female. So this is a male here on the left, and then this is a female, and she was actually lactating, as you can see from her nipples here. So that was really exciting for us to find this female, because it's really hard to work out if our squirrels are breeding in the sort of environments that we work in. So this was confirmed as a breeding squirrel, which is very exciting. So we're still sort of in the preliminary stages of this live trapping project that we've got going on at the moment. But from the work that we've done so far, we've already identified unique haplotypes to our area of Mid Wales. We've found the Welsh haplotypes, of which there's a few, but we've also found 2 completely unique haplotypes to the Mid Wales population, which is really exciting because it sort of gives some evidence to the idea that the red squirrels that we've got here in Mid Wales have survived since the original red squirrel population, rather than being reintroductions over the years. We are the only red squirrel project in Wales at the moment that hasn't had reinforcements done. So it looks like we do have unique haplotypes that were from historical times, which is very exciting. So we've been moving through all of our different red squirrel woodlands live trapping. So this photograph here is of a woodland called Clocaenog. It's part of the Towie Forest, and most of the photographs and videos that you've seen in this presentation have been from Clocaenog. Clocaenog is our best red squirrel site, or it was up until last year. So we tried to live trap in Clocaenog last year and didn't get any squirrels at all, which was a little bit worrying. So we decided to do what's called a random encounter model with camera traps to work out if there was actually no squirrels in Clocaenog or if they had just moved into a different area than we were used to. So a random encounter model involves a grid pattern of camera traps. You can see these on the photograph here, and you put a camera trap at each of these locations. So these are about 75 meters apart. You can do this for all sorts of different species, and the distance of the cameras differs depending on what species you use. It depends on the home range of the squirrel. And in this case, red squirrels have quite small home territories, so you put the cameras very, very close together. So yeah, we had, I think it was in the end, 200 camera locations across the forest, and we didn't get a single red squirrel in this forest, which was obviously a little bit concerning, particularly it was our best site up until that point, and it was also a very resource heavy sort of project. So what happened in Clocaenog? We think it's a combination of different things. If you'll remember last year, it was incredibly hot, and we had a real heat wave here in Wales, and that meant it was very difficult for most of our mammal species to find food and most importantly water. Plant material wasn't growing very well last year because of the hot weather, and offspring weren't surviving because the parents were very dehydrated and weren't producing enough milk to raise them. So we think it was a huge amount to do with that. We also think we have potentially lost one of our female red squirrels that was in the area. And it was potentially a female that was very mobile and turned up on a lot of cameras. As I've said, it's really difficult to tell red squirrels apart, which is part of the reason we did the live trapping, to make it easier. So we think it was a combination of different reasons, but whatever it was, we must assume that the population, even in our best woodland, is very, very low and not very resilient to changes in the environment. But it is important to remember that we do have some squirrels still here in Mid Wales, and our main goal is still to boost our population. But it can't be ignored that we've tried to do this for quite a few years, and we've had minimal success here. And this is only likely to get harder with the continuation of really hot summers and continued habitat fragmentation, both through normal harvesting of trees and also new tree diseases which keep popping up. So is it time to consider reinforcement in this area? Squirrels are rodents, and their life strategy revolves around meeting each other and having lots of babies really quickly. So by releasing more animals into the area, we'll improve the chances for the existing animals rather than outcompeting them. But is it ethical to release squirrels in what we know is really bad squirrel habitat, where our reds are only just clinging on? We also have our unique haplotype here. Do we want to dilute it? So these are the questions that our project in the next 12 months is going to be asking itself, and sort of working out what our next steps are in terms of applying for funding and in terms of what we think would be the best hope for our red squirrels here. Just a last bit on pine martens, as they're always sort of hailed as the sort of saviour of red squirrels. Pine martens have suffered similarly to reds in the past. They've really suffered through habitat loss, through fragmentation, and they're sort of continuingly struggling with removal of trees and tree diseases. But in 2015, we had a population of pine martens reintroduced to the Aberystwyth Devil's Bridge area, and these animals are sort of slowly spreading down, and they're present and they're breeding quite happily in the red squirrel focal zone. So they quite often turn up on our camera traps and in our traps. They both share a love of peanuts, both species, so sometimes it's quite tricky to monitor with martens about, because they do like to steal all the food. But we know that they eat grey squirrels. We've had multiple cases on our camera traps of them catching and eating grey squirrels, but whether or not they're having a big enough impact on the population as a whole is yet to be seen. Most of the research that's come out shows that you need a really high population of pine martens to have a significant impact on the grey squirrel population, and our pine martens in mid Wales aren't going to be at that level for probably another 20 to 30 years. So whilst it's looking interesting and it's sort of hopeful to have martens back in the area, they're certainly not a silver bullet to red squirrel conservation, but it is important to note that if you're protecting habitat for pine martens, you're also protecting it for red squirrels and vice versa. So hopefully with their return, amongst many other things that the Red Squirrel Project are doing, such as grey squirrel control, monitoring and potential reinforcements, the future looks a little bit brighter for red squirrels here in mid Wales. So that's everything I've got to say so far. I think we're going to do questions at the end. So I think I'll just pass over to Caro, if that's all right, Kay?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks very much, Josie. Great news about the expanded focal zone. And yes, pass over to Caro.
Brilliant. Cool. Hi, everyone. You'll just have to give me a second whilst I set up my screen sharing.
Josie, I think you're still sharing your screen.
Oh, sorry. Let me just... There we go. Is that done that there?
Yes.
Perfect. That working?
Yeah, that looks great. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Caro. I'm the Red Squirrel Ranger for Clocaenog. I've been in post for about 4 months now. I work for the Red Squirrel Trust Wales on the Magical Mammals project, which is a National Lottery Heritage Fund project, which goes on for 5 years. We've been match funded by the Clocaenog Forest Wind Farm Fund, and we work in close partnership with the Clocaenog Red Squirrels Trust and NRW. The Magical Mammals follows on from a previous lottery funded project, which was Red Squirrels United. This ran between 2016 and 2020, so it was a 4-year project. But the main difference between that project and Magical Mammals is that Magical Mammals is focused on Wales only, whereas Red Squirrels United was a UK-wide project. So there are 2 main areas which Magical Mammals focuses on. There's a Clocaenog, where I work, and we also have a bit going on in Gwynedd and Anglesey. And I have a counterpart ranger, Geraint, who covers those areas. Oh dear, my PowerPoint's gone a bit funny, but what that says is the main goals of the project are that in Clocaenog, it's to release red squirrels back into Clocaenog to top up the numbers that we have, and also to get people from all walks of life involved in conservation. Over in Gwynedd, as Josie touched on a bit on pine martens, we're also doing some pine marten releases. This is a pine marten that we actually caught on camera in Clocaenog. There haven't been any pine marten releases into Clocaenog, but it's thought that this individual probably made its way up here from the releases that Josie mentioned in Aberystwyth, because they're super wide-ranging animals. But one of the ideas is they're going to be releasing pine martens into the Gwynedd area, because they're critically endangered in England and Wales. So we really want to bolster their numbers. And as we've previously discussed in the other presentation, they've been shown to suppress grey squirrel numbers if they're in high enough density. So they're a real asset to red squirrel conservation as well. These are some of our release enclosures from previous translocations that happened during the Red Squirrels United project. They're basically a big sort of wooden structure with a mesh, and there's little exit points at each of the corners for the red squirrels. At the moment, we're in a process of scoping where we're going to be putting enclosures for the next series of translocations as part of the Magical Mammals project. Things that we're bearing in mind when we're thinking about where to put these is the felling schedule. Clocaenog is also a plantation woodland, so it is managed commercially on a felling rotation. So we want to make sure where we're putting these enclosures, we have a continuous canopy cover so that the red squirrels can make their way out into the surrounding countryside. We also want to make sure that we're putting them in areas with the right maturity of trees so that they have sufficient food supply. Before the red squirrels are put in these enclosures, they go through a health screening process for 2 weeks to make sure they're nice and healthy and they're not going to be bringing any disease to our current population. And they're housed for no longer than 3 weeks if they're captive bred and 2 weeks if they're wild bred. This is to minimize the risk of predators finding them and causing them stress. Pine martens are predators of red squirrels, and if they find the red squirrels in the enclosure, they'll basically come back and hassle them again and again, and that causes them a lot of stress. So we really don't want that to happen, which is why we try to minimize the amount of time we keep red squirrels in these enclosures before we release them. Here's a little infographic. I'm sorry that the key is a little bit small, but if I try and blow up the picture, it goes really blurry. So I'll have to kind of explain to you what's going on. So what the key says is this is a distribution of red squirrels from 1945. Red is where we have red squirrels only. Grey is where we have grey squirrels only, and orange is both. So as you can see, most of the UK in 1945 was predominated by red squirrels. We had a small area in the southeast, which was grey squirrels only, and then a little buffer zone around those grey areas, which was both species. If we fast forward 50 years, you can see that that distribution has been completely flipped on its head. And now the UK is predominated by grey squirrels. If we look really closely at Wales, you can see there's 3 main little blobs of colour. We have down in mid Wales, we have the little orange blob, which is Cambrian Mountains, where Josie's project is. And then above that, we have Clocaenog, which is where I am. And then over here, we have Anglesey, and you can see there's a tiny little orange and red blob in the corner. Between 2000 and 2010, Anglesey underwent a program of grey squirrel control, which was massively successful. And if we fast forward 10 years, you can see that there are no grey squirrels at all on the island, and that holds true to today. We're now going to just hop over to Clocaenog where I am, and we're going to zoom in a little bit. And this is a satellite imagery, a photo of Clocaenog. You can see this big dark green patch in the middle here, and it sort of goes all the way over to Llynbrennig and the Alwyn Reservoir. So all this dark green is Clocaenog, where our red squirrel project is. You'll see it's patchy because it's also, plantation woodland. And that's going to be a recurring theme with red squirrel projects, because like Josie said, it's really the only habitat that red squirrels can survive in, because it's not optimal habitat and they can make use of it in ways that grey squirrels can't. Clocaenog is about 5,000 hectares, so we're a little bit smaller than the Mid Wales project. And the most recent estimate of the number of red squirrels in Clocaenog was put at about 50 individuals. So that's about 1 red squirrel per 100 hectares. And to make that, a bit more visualizable, 1 hectare is about 2.5 football pitches. So, it's quite a big area, and it's, again, not a very big population of red squirrels. The woodland is also primarily Sitka spruce. So same as the Cambrian Mountains. So you're going to see a lot of parallels between the 2 projects in this talk. Following on from the Red Squirrels United project that ran between 2016 and 2020, it was realised that there was no body of red squirrel conservation in Clocaenog, and that's when the Clocaenog Red Squirrel Trust was set up. The main sort of way that Clocaenog monitor red squirrels is with cameras. So you'll see this is a image from one of our trail cameras, and what the volunteers do is we put out these little feeder boxes, They're designed as bird feeders, but they work really well because we can put hazelnuts in them, and the squirrels can't access the hazelnuts, so they act as bait. Basically, they draw in squirrels, but they can't remove the nuts. So sometimes we'll get grey squirrels, sometimes we'll get red squirrels, but it basically allows us to see what's about. If we find that it's primarily red squirrels visiting the feeder, we can then pop up one of these feeder boxes and change to sort of like a more of a supplementary feeding style. These have a hinged lid, so they can open up. The red squirrels can access the hazelnuts inside, and they can feed on them or cache them for later. We also have these fancy feeder boxes, which Josie touched on. These are the radio frequency identification feeder boxes. So basically, they have a little magnet up here. We have at the moment 6 red squirrels in Clocaenog which have been chipped. And when they go to access the food, they lift up the lid, and this triggers the magnet, and it means that it can read the individual that's been there. So each chip has specific sort of data on it, such as a number, which allows us to identify which squirrel it is, their sex and their weight when they were chipped. There's also a strain gauge at the bottom of these feeder boxes, which weigh the squirrel when they visit the box. And this allows us to collect really great additional data that the trail cameras on their own on feeder boxes can't, such as what condition the squirrels are in. So if they're in good breeding condition, and if we're coming up to winter, if they've got enough weight on them to make it over winter. It also allows us to create a really great map of where the red squirrels are traveling about in the forest and which areas they're using. So a combination of our trail camera data and our RFID feeder data has allowed us to establish that you find red squirrels in low numbers pretty much throughout Clocaenog, but there are definite hotspots of activity in areas where we've done previous releases and translocations. So some of the challenges we face, again, this is going to be a bit of a repeat from Josie's presentation, but really it's all the same challenges. The main one is that Clocaenog is plantation forest, so it's managed commercially. Coops are sold and then felled. This causes a loss of habitat, for the red squirrels, or a loss of continuous canopy cover, which allows movement from one area to the other, which is obviously pretty detrimental. When they're felled to the ground, any animal which is using that area has to move elsewhere. Quite excitingly, though, we had a talk with NRW a few weeks ago where they told us about a new sort of method of felling they've been trialling in a few areas of the forest, where instead of going for the classic clear fell of big coops, they're cutting sort of like smaller circular clearings in the forest with one extraction route out. And then when they're planting up, they're trying to make sure that they're planting up a mix of different species, and that each of these circular sort of coops are planted up at different stages of maturity. So in this way, it's still allowing them to commercially work the forest, but without that massive sort of detrimental loss of canopy cover that clear felling a big area does. I thought this was really exciting, and I'm really hopeful they're going to start rolling that out to other areas, because that's going to be a really big sort of benefit to red squirrel conservation if we can do more more felling in this style. The other big challenge again is squirrel pox virus. As Josie covered, if the squirrels catch squirrel pox virus, generally it's a fatal disease. So yeah, that would have a massive impact on the population. Obviously in Clocaenog, we do a lot of sort of work with feeder boxes, which is a sort of high risk area for transmission, but all our volunteers are super careful to make sure that whenever we're visiting the feeder boxes, we're sanitizing them and sanitizing all equipment. And it also allows us to see if grey squirrels are popping up on the cameras in areas which are regularly used by reds. It's somewhere where we go and focus all our efforts on trapping to try and make sure the populations are remaining separate. So hopefully we won't get an outbreak of squirrel pox virus. But that sort of leads on to our third challenge, which is that our population in Clocaenog is very small. So like I said, the most recent estimate was about 50 individuals. A forest of this size, 5,000 hectares, in reality would be able to support a healthy population of about 300 to 400 individuals. So small populations are much more susceptible to random events, things like outbreaks of disease, an increase in predation, potentially has the impact to wipe out a small population. And talking long term, a small population has much lower genetic diversity, which means they're much more susceptible to long term problems like climate change. They're less able to adapt. So a very big problem for Clocaenog is the size of the population, which is why the Magical Mammals project has such a heavy focus on releasing new individuals into the forest to bolster that genetic diversity, and also to hopefully bolster their numbers and to allow it sort of it to naturally grow. Over the course of the project, we're hoping to release about 20 red squirrels into the forest, and hopefully that will make a really big impact on the numbers we have. Ways that you can get involved if you're local to the area. There's obviously the option of joining Clocaenog Red Squirrel Trust and getting involved with our trail camera monitoring. The more people we have monitoring trail cameras, the better idea we get of how many red squirrels we have, what they're doing, what sort of condition they're in, and it allows us to collect really valuable data. Or there's the option of following us on social media, keeping it up to date with what we're doing. We're also trying to run a bit of a citizen science project at the moment. We're encouraging people who are out in Clocaenog to have a look for feeding signs in the forest. If you find feeding signs, you can email them to us at sightings@clocaenog-rst.org. Take a photo, give us a description of what you saw, and tell us where it was. These are some hazelnuts, which have been, the top ones have been eaten by red squirrels. As Josie touched on, you can tell who's eaten things by how they've eaten them. So red squirrels will crack the hazelnuts cleanly in half like that. Unfortunately, grey squirrels pretty much eat things in the same way, so you can't really tell if it's a red or a grey. But if we get feeding signs, we can go and put a camera up, and that will tell us if it is a red or a grey. And these bottom ones here have either been eaten by a mouse or a vole. You'll see that they nibble a very neat circle into them, unlike those squirrels. Here we have a spruce cone, which has been eaten by a squirrel. They make these distinctive feeding stations, so they'll find a little perch, something like a root, like you can see in this photo, or a tree stump, and they'll generally pick all the scales off of the cone and leave them in a little pile like this. And as Josie covered, if you see the sort of way they eat it, it makes these sort of raggedy, sort of like scraggly edges, whereas mice and voles will nibble them down to a neat core. I'm also running a sort of walk and talk at Bod Pet tomorrow. So if anyone's not got anything on and are local, you can come and join me there and ask more questions and have a look at what we're doing. And other than that, that's kind of it from me. So thanks for listening. And if anyone has any questions, either me or Josie.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much, Caro. I wish I could join you for the walk and talk tomorrow. That sounds brilliant. We've got a couple of questions and a comment. Somebody said that they've recorded grey squirrels well inside a Sitka-dominated commercial conifer forest in Northumberland on multiple occasions. And I think that is one of the issues, isn't it, with these forests, that actually, while they keep out the grey squirrels a certain amount of time, they don't completely stop them from taking over, and they will eventually take over. So which is why your conservation work is so very important. We've got a question to Caro. When do you plan a release of red squirrels?
So hopefully the next series of releases will be taking place this autumn, which is why we're in that process now of what I talked about, where we're scoping out where we're going to be putting the enclosures, and we're getting ready for that to happen.
Brilliant. I think Josh Twining and his colleagues have published a study in which an occupancy model indicates a positive relationship between pine marten and red squirrels in good habitat, but a negative relationship in poor habitats such as conifer plantations, and asked what your views were on that. And I was going to ask something similar, around so you're catching pine marten predating on grey squirrels through the camera traps. Have you had any evidence of them predating red squirrels?
Yeah, so I actually worked on the pine marten reintroduction in Wales and the Forest of Dean one. So pine martens are really my bread and butter. I think what I was trying to get across in my talk, and Caro also touched on this, pine martens are not a silver bullet. They are not going to save red squirrels, and anyone who suggests such doesn't know enough about the really complex situation that's going on. what I think is really important to get across is that pine martens are a native species, and they have coexisted with red squirrels in Scotland for 10,000 years and on the continent quite happily. Red squirrels are a natural part of a pine marten's diet, but they're not a main part of a pine marten's diet in any sense. Pine martens have such a variable diet, and it's so seasonal. The most biggest part of their diet is field voles, and even that is only 30% of their diet, and that is the thing they eat the most of. So it's really variable, and it's really individual for each marten as well. So to answer the actual question, have we evidence? Not in the mid Wales population, although I'm not sure up in North Wales. Caro will have to answer that. I think that comes down to, it's not necessarily because they're not predating them or not eating them, it's because we have so few pine martens and so few red squirrels. What are the chances of them actually interacting? As those populations increase, we'll see a lot more of that sort of interaction. We did do diet studies of our reintroduced martens in mid Wales, and the biggest thing that came up in their diet was field voles, obviously, and then there was quite a large amount of grey squirrel remains, and also rabbits. So up in Scotland, they supplement their diet in the winter a lot with deer carrion, and we really don't have a deer population in Wales, or certainly not enough to support that sort of diet. So we think they were supplementing with rabbits and grey squirrels, because we have an awful lot of rabbits in that area. But one diet study does not, it's not, perfect evidence, because these animals are so changeable and they're so intelligent. So each one really does behave differently to a different pine marten in a way that a lot of our other species don't, because they don't have that sort of higher intelligence. But yeah, so it's something that we are monitoring, particularly in our population of reds, and particularly because we have martens and reds turning up on the same camera constantly. But yeah, I've read Josh Twining's work, and it's very interesting, and it's certainly another piece of the puzzle, and I suspect we'll see a lot more evidence in coming years about similar, it's not black and white. Pine martens will not save the red squirrel, but hopefully there'll be a small piece in the puzzle that will help just push them back into a good population.
Yeah, definitely. Caro, did you want to talk about anything pine marten related in Wales in terms of that? Or
I think Josie rounded that up really succinctly. But the one thing I was going to add was obviously like you said, Josie, in a sort of natural environment, there's so few pine martens and so few red squirrels, they're not really very likely to interact. But the problem is that we're intervening, is that we're putting out these feeder stations, and really that does bring them together. Especially, I suppose, in Clocaenog, there is a bit of a worry that, there's such a small population of red squirrels that if pine martens were to predate them, it might actually have quite a big impact on the population. But we haven't had any evidence that they are predating them. I think the biggest concern is that when we put red squirrels into the release enclosures, they have to be in there for at least 2 weeks before they can be released into the wild. And in that period, that is a sort of time when if the predator works out they're there, like a pine marten, they will come and sort of harass them, and that can cause red squirrels to die from stress. So yeah, it is an interesting one, because obviously they're a massive benefit to sort of red squirrel conservation, but in some ways they still are a predator. But like you said, nothing's ever black and white in conservation, isn't it? It's finding that fine line.
And I think a lot of people have looked at what's happening in Ireland and Northern Ireland with the metroneck spread of the pine marten. I think nobody's quite sure whether it's predation or a fear.
It's a bit of both, I think. And what's important to remember about Ireland is that they didn't lose pine martens and they didn't lose red squirrels in the same way that we have in Wales. So it's a completely novel situation that we've got here in Wales compared. Just to since we're on pine martens, I've just noticed another question from Norman, I believe, about capercaillie. I think what's important to remember about the capercaillie population is that was completely extinct through shooting, and the capercaillie that we have in Scotland were reintroduced. So they're already a weird population going on in the Cairngorms, and the studies that have been done, I'm not sure exactly which study you're referring to, but the studies that I've seen were actually what they did is they put fake eggs in fake capercaillie nests, and what seems to have happened is the pine marten was following the scent of the person and clearing out a lot of nests, because they're very intelligent and they know people create food. And so from what I understand, the studies that have been done on the capercaillie aren't very robust, I think is the right way to put it. The biggest problem for capercaillie is habitat loss, as it is for all of our animals, and deer fencing in Scotland, which is trying to stop habitat loss. It's all just a very complicated muddle, unfortunately, because for people that don't know, there's an awful lot of deer fencing that has gone up across Scotland to help protect regeneration of woodland, which is obviously really important, but capercaillie fly straight into them, so and then they die. So with any population that has been put out of balance, predation is then going to have a bigger impact. Pine martens definitely do eat capercaillie. They eat pretty much anything, but they'll eat whatever is local and whatever is plentiful. They're not, they want an easy life. They'll go for whatever is easy to catch. And in the autumn, that is mostly bilberries and blackberries is what they will fill their bellies with, because it's simple and they're lazy.
And I believe in Ireland, Northern Ireland, they don't have the field voles that they rely on in Britain as a key species over there. So perhaps again they're utilising more of the grey squirrel.
Absolutely, yeah. We just don't know enough. None of our mammals are studied well enough. Even the badger, which is the most highly studied mammal because of the TB problem, we still know next to nothing about them. They're such secretive creatures, all of our mammals. And there's not enough funding to really accurately know any of the answers to these questions. So hopefully in coming years with new funding and people being more interested in conservation, we can answer some of these questions.
Projects like these as well,
Yeah, definitely. And I was interested in you talking about Natural Resources Wales and how they've changing their felling and looking at those smaller circular felling and trying to, I guess, using that as a way to increase diversity within the woodland, as well as it being safer for red squirrel conservation. When you're working with landowners and they have done these clear fell sites and they might be, plantation forestry, are you looking to try and encourage them to change their plantings, so to make it more species diverse and age diverse, or is that, I know that risks then encouraging more grey squirrels?
Yeah, so we do an awful lot of that. So what we tend to do is encourage planting of Scots pine rather than Sitka, because that provides slightly more food without putting a lot of risk in. We're also about to start a research project with Vincent Wildlife Trust to sort of work out how much broadleaf you can have within a Sitka spruce plantation before it becomes an issue for grays, before the risk is high. I know there's always a risk, but before it becomes too risky. Or what is the buffer zone of plantation you need to have a core of broadleaf in the middle that greys won't traverse? We don't know if the answer is there is no buffer big enough. Grey squirrels will do what they do, but these, like I say, these questions have never been answered before, because there's never been. I think it's to say it'll be the same for Caro's project with red squirrel funding. You're chasing your tail a lot of the time to try and reinvent the wheel, because funders want to fund something new and exciting. Obviously habitat loss is the biggest problem, but really the biggest problem red squirrel conservation faces is lack of funding, and lack of continuous funding for monitoring projects, so we know how things are changing over a large time period. Yeah, that's fantastic. So there's a question: are you using thermal imaging as a survey tool? It's proved valuable, for checking pine marten in den nest boxes, so I wondered whether they could be used for squirrels too.
Ooh.
So I've heard of people using thermal imaging when they're going out and doing grey squirrel management and find squirrels, but
so we're not using it on the project at the moment, but simply because we don't have nest boxes out, and with a dray situation you wouldn't be able to tell if it was red or grey regardless from the thermal. I've used thermals quite a lot with pine marten conservation. They're not as black and white as people think they are. So you can tell that there's with the den boxes, pine martens, you can tell there's an animal in it, but it's very difficult to tell how many animals, whether or not it's a grey squirrel or a pine marten. It does definitely help, because if there's nothing in the box, then you can, say there's nothing in it. But the big problem we have with our pine marten boxes is that they get filled up with squirrel dray material. So regardless, and the thermal doesn't show that, so regardless you still have to go in and open the box and clear out that dray material. And I can imagine it's the same for red squirrel nest boxes as well. You still want to go in and clear it out of any sort of potential disease risk. But thermals are very exciting, and they're also coming down massively in price. So up until very recently, it was just completely out of the budget of most conservation organisations to get one. They were like, you know, $3 or $4 grand, you know, that's months of salary for staff members. So but it's looking likely that they're becoming much more affordable now. And I say affordable and reliable. It's always the balance, you know.
Yeah, it's been put into the new forestry operations guidance for England that if people are doing surveying for red squirrels before doing any forestry operations, that thermal imaging is one of those tools that people could utilize.
Same here. It's the same kind of situation here in that we don't have any nest boxes up, and also it's a sort of a limited amount of funding, and as Josie said, up until now they've been very expensive. There just hasn't been money available for that sort of thing.
So with these special feeders that you've got, do you find there's much competition around the feeders? So do you find some red squirrels dominate the food source more than others?
So I wouldn't say dominate, but we tend to find that specific individuals that turn up quite regularly at the same box. And I suppose it's as we touched on earlier, it's because red squirrels aren't quite as wide ranging as other animals, so they tend to keep in their little area. But
Josie, you said you know your population in Mid Wales is part of the original population of red squirrels that was in the UK, and they did
think, but yeah.
So I know it's similar with the Isle of Wight. They think that they think similar. But would you consider any reinforcements of the population in the future?
So we're sort of seriously considering it at the moment, mainly because of the difficult year we had last year, a lot related to the weather. And I think if it was a one-off year of very hot, dry weather, it would be okay. But I think we can all agree that we're going to have a lot more summers like last summer and a lot more winters like we had last winter. And from the monitoring that we did last year, our squirrels were struggling more than they normally would. We don't think we had many, if any, kits born last year within the focal zone, because of the lack of food and lack of water available. We think our adults survived, or at least a normal amount survived, you know, just normal mortality for the adults, but they just weren't producing offspring. Our squirrels only produce 1 litter a year anyway. You know, in other areas they produce 2 a year, but the food's just not good enough, so they're only producing 1 litter a year. So it is now the time to think about it. So that's what we'll be doing over the next few months, is seriously considering it. But we have to think about the ethical implications of releasing in bad habitat. We also have to think about protecting the haplotype, although we had the same conversation about the relict Welsh haplotype animal that we had of pine martins, and it was just sort of thought that if it's still surviving, it's surviving in such low numbers that it's not going to survive for much longer. So there's no sort of danger in diluting it. I should clarify for people who don't know, it's not a separate subspecies, it's a haplotype of DNA. So it's more to do with geographical provenance rather than, it's not a different species of reds that we've got here. But yeah, there's a lot to consider, but it's definitely on the table at the moment for our population here. But yeah, we need to think more about habitat and about what is the likelihood of it actually succeeding, because, you know, in some ways you've got to try, so you know, but yeah, we've got a lot to think about before we get to that stage. Also, it's very expensive. So to do it properly, it is very expensive, but it may well be worthwhile. But that's our next sort of 6 months or so is talking about that.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. There's a question, are there bird species conservation projects which support your projects in the same way pine martins do? And I've noticed somebody once said to me that actually goshawks are better predators of grey squirrels than pine marten.
They are very good. I don't know about you, Caro. I don't know any specific bird projects that are partnered with red squirrel projects, but we certainly chat a lot with RSPP and a lot with Wildlife Trust charities and stuff. So there's a lot of interactions going on. But
yeah, when I heard that question, obviously, like you, the thing that popped into mind was the goshawks, and actually we have a pretty good population of goshawks in Clocaenog, but I'm afraid they're mostly just trying to predate things. They often turn up on the trail cameras actually as well, swooping in trying to get squirrels and stuff. But I can't think of any conservation projects of birds which are like a good partnership. But again, interesting one to look into.
Yeah.
I think it's all about landscape scale conservation. I think conservation is moving away from single species projects. I say that we're both on single species projects, but we don't consider the red squirrel in isolation.
No.
Most conservation projects don't anymore. It's not about one species. You might
That's it.
flagship your project on a species, but we're always talking to other landowners, other species projects to work to build a robust habitat that supports creatures rather than just supporting an individual animal, because it never works. You know, you can't support one animal, one species, because that will be at the detriment of another. You know, if you support pine marten reintroduction, then that can cause problems for red squirrels. If you support red squirrel introduction, that means you have to have really crap tree habitat. You can't ever support bird species. So, you know, it's all about finding a balance in this world that we find ourselves in that's somewhat unnatural.
I think if red squirrels can be used as a flagship species for healthy, you know, diverse woodland, but it just depends what you've kind of got around you, haven't you? And it's moving that away from that idea that it's only, I know I've heard it said many times that, oh, they can only live in, you know, plantation forestry, but people that don't quite understand, you know, the habitat we used to have and where they used to thrive.
And protection for any species like is good because it transfers onto the other species as well in the forest. So, like you said, we've Charlotte Armitage has been doing quite a lot of work on the dormice, which is great, and we try and support each other by sending each other like footage from our trail cameras, because any protection a dormice gets is protection for the areas that the red squirrels are in. So like you're in, it's about kind of it's never one species in isolation, is it? It's about thinking about everything.
Yeah, definitely. I know somebody asked me once if grey squirrels impacted dormice through, you know, their eating of hazelnuts and things like that before they're ripe. I didn't know.
I think everything impacts everything, right? I know it's a really vague answer, but I think that's what we try to get across in biodiversity now, is that nothing is in isolation. And I'm sure grey squirrels do impact dormice, but does that mean that more dormice would limit how many grey squirrels could be there? And it's all, you know,
that's it.
Nothing is simple.
Yeah, and in a healthy habitat, like it would all regulate itself and our input wouldn't be needed. And the problem is that it's all suboptimal habitat and everything's a bit skew-if, isn't it?
That's a really important point, Karen. Like if in a healthy habitat, a pine marten predating a red squirrel wouldn't matter. Rodents are a prey species, as are dormice. You know, they're meant to be a part of other animals' diet, and at the moment we don't have enough to spare to have the predation, you know, level. But in a healthy, robust habitat, predation is a natural part of life, and a robust population should be able to survive that quite happily.
And that's how they keep each other in balance, isn't it? So you don't get too much of one or the other pushing the balance out. Josie, is there a chance that you can introduce a water source within your area, such as a dam, stream, or dig a pond, as there will always be a big problem with climate change?
So so the area that we work in is massive. So it's like, as I say, the Towie Forest is 6,000 hectares, and that's actually only about less than half of our area that we work in. So there are an awful lot of rivers, streams, drainage ponds, such that they're there. Basically, because it's plantation forestry, there's very little like natural water. So during the drought we had last year, the natural streams and rivers survived, but all of the artificial drainage ponds and ditches were just completely dry. So in theory we could dig ponds, but they're not going to survive that hot weather anyway. They would need a constant source of water, and because of the way that commercial plantation works and forestry harvesting, you know, quotas and such, it's a constant changeable beast. So it's just basically a lot more effort than the squirrels would get out of it, because also they don't do well with disturbance. So if you're disturbing an area, putting streams and ditches in that then the squirrels are going to move out of as soon as they harvest anyway, and it's just a constant balancing act. If we worked in a small woodland where we had red squirrels, we would definitely be recommending to provide a water source, but because we work in this huge environment, we basically couldn't provide enough water sources to cover that whole area, because it is so changeable, which I know isn't a very good, like, it's not particularly a helpful answer, but unfortunately it's just not possible.
No, I remember Terry Abraham, who's doing the documentary The Cumbrian Red, did a video last year. There was a stump in a woodland that's had a dip in it that still, and everything was going there to drink from it because there was not a lot of anything else around. Yeah.
I just noticed a question earlier, Kay, that I think has been lost in the things, and it was to do with the traps staying wrapped them in black sheeting. So we did used to do this, particularly with grey squirrel control traps. But all that happens is the grey squirrel will pull through the plastic bin bag and tear it into pieces. And then, number one, they're ingesting plastic. And then you get plastic all over the littering the floor. So what we did, I don't know if it was very clear on the photograph I showed, but our traps, the back third is full wood. So they're enclosed in wood. So there is essentially a den box at the back of the trap for the squirrel to retreat into, and we've had massive reductions in trap injuries through using that system. And we elevate our traps as well, because if you start using floor traps for particularly protected species, you can get problems with badgers and just more interactions on the ground. So we always elevate our traps for that reason.
Debating on what's in the trap, or trying to protect what's in.
Yeah, so we had massive problems actually. This wasn't in Mid Wales, but in Scotland, where we've trapped, and in the Forest of Dean, because they have wild boar. And you can't trap anything on the ground, because it's not necessarily predation, it's more just curiosity, but they're such massive animals that they will just trash the traps. And also we find putting them up is just easier for the staff as well, because then they're at chest height for removing animals from. But yeah, so we've had much better success with elevating our traps, and with this wooden box on the back. Sometimes the squirrel does not want to leave said wooden box, but with the bin bag system that's been used before, it's just not reliable enough. Although some of our trap loan scheme volunteers for grey squirrel control do use that in their gardens, because that is easier to monitor when it's sort of in your back garden versus when it's out in the woods.
Yeah, it does look like a more solid and weatherproof refuge as well for the animals, the box. There's a question here: are both your projects advocating grey squirrel management beyond your boundaries? If so, do you have any data on the effectiveness of this, and are you also asking landowners to work together to make the best of the management?
Yes, we do advocate for outside of project trapping, but we would rather people trap within our projects because it's helpful to us. The main reason we advocate for it is to raise awareness. At the moment, I don't have any data on the effectiveness of it. That is something that I'm trying to track down personally at the moment. So if anyone's got any information on that, please do. But when I give talks in the sort of urban areas like Aberystwyth, Cardiff, Swansea, we talk about it because it's so important that people realise that feeding a grey squirrel in your garden is going to have an impact on red squirrels that are 100 miles away. Every grey squirrel that is fed and protected and survives to have offspring produces more grey squirrels, which will have an impact on our reds. Personally, I don't think trapping in a garden in Aberystwyth, like hill trapping or cranial dispatch in a live trap, is going to massively impact the reds that we have in our area. But the awareness that it raises is so important, so important, because Karen sort of alluded to it earlier, but you can have some controversy surrounding grey squirrel control. And that can be quite difficult, but and it's not a nice part of the job, but it is so important for our reds. And it's also important to remember that grey squirrels are not only a problem for red squirrels, they cause huge problems for forestry. They bark strip broadleaf trees particularly really badly. They cause a lot of issues. They also predate birds' nests. So a lot of our RSVP reserves around here will grey squirrel control, not for reds, but for bird nest protection. So it's not just the reds that will benefit from grey squirrel control, and getting that message out is really important.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of Clocaenog, no, I wouldn't say at the moment we're advocating for grey squirrel control beyond our boundaries, because at the moment trying to get enough grey squirrel control going on within our boundaries is enough of a struggle. So at the moment we have one NRW contract for grey squirrel trapping, which is excellent and really well needed, but because there was no grey squirrel trapping going on over winter, there's been an absolute bumper whilst it hasn't been going on. At the moment it's quite a big problem. We're getting a lot of greys turning up on cameras in areas where we haven't before, and it's quite worrying seeing that. As part of the Magical Mammals project, there's a little bit more money for an additional Magical Mammals grey squirrel control sort of contract, and we have a few volunteers who trap, but really at the moment we're just trying to get the number of greys control within our boundaries before we start thinking about pushing it out to outside.
Yeah, Yeah. Do you find that because you're in a red squirrel area that it's easier to get people to do management of grey squirrels in those areas? Are you winning people over? And if other people are doing it next door to each other, then
yeah, there's definitely the bedrock of the awareness is already there in the red squirrel zones, I think. And we do have plenty of volunteers that don't want to do the control of the squirrels themselves, but they'll host the traps, and then they can call a member of staff or one of the other volunteers locally to do the actual dispatching, which is, you know, a sort of a nice compromise. So they understand that it's important and they understand that it needs to be done, but they just don't want to necessarily do it themselves. So that's, you know, and then eventually a lot of them, you know, come full circle, as it were, and are quite happy to get involved after that. But
this question says, have you considered using scent detection dogs? I understand distinction can now be made between red and greys.
Yes, always considering scent detection dogs. I'm a big dog advocate. However, especially in our area, they're just not that useful because of the size of the area that we work on. If we were trying to distinguish, you know, whether we've got reds or greys in a den box, for instance, or reds or greys using a certain tray, they could be helpful, but we already have a big enough problem. Sort of using a scent detection dog would sort of increase our range slightly when we were doing things like cone searches, but not enough to justify the cost. And there's also scent detection dogs. If we had a dog ourselves that we could train up, you know, one of our staff members wanted to get involved in that, then that might be slightly different. But we certainly can't justify the money at the moment. But I do believe that they can be a very valuable asset, but just not in their current state. You're right that they can differentiate between reds and greys. I think they're much more useful for potentially things like hedgehogs and that sort of side of things. But maybe in a few years, who knows what will happen with them.
Yeah, I've heard them being used to find dead red squirrels, what they've had squirrel pox, so you have a better understanding if they've died of the undergrowth of how many red squirrels are dying and how big the problem is.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely uses for them, but certainly not for our project at the moment. Is it a justified use at the moment? But I'm always hopeful we can get some dogs on the project.
So I think that's one of the things I'd train it to do.
Yeah, like you said, money makes the world go round. All of these are like great ideas, but unfortunately everything boils down to money, doesn't it? And when you have projects like this, often the funding's quite tight and you just don't have the available funds for additional sort of measures like that, do you?
No, it's about doing as much as you can with what you have, isn't it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all of the questions. Is there anything both of you wanted to say, just as kind of like departing words to everybody?
Reporting sightings wherever they are, because you don't know how important they might be. It's all too easy to ignore something because you think, oh, someone will be monitoring it. But that doesn't just go for red squirrels. Anything that's, you know, any mammal species, really, report it into your local record centre. Because one of the bigger problems is underreporting of a lot of species, and we just don't know. And we can use local record centres records to help our project and to support funding applications. And again, not just for red squirrels, water voles, dormice, you know, pine martens, deer even in Wales is really important because there's so few of them. So make sure you're telling someone.
Where should you report your sightings, Josie? Where's the best? For Wales, what's the
for red squirrels, us, you know, me and Caro, you know, but your local record centre is your best resource. So you can just Google local record centre and your area, and they will take anything. And I mean, the most common species that you know of, they will take a record of it because it's all important. And that's how we monitor trends, you know, particularly with climate change, it's going to become all the more important. And local record centres, we can then get the information from for any species. We can ask for a request of data. So so long as it's getting reported to the local record centre, we can find the information on it. But if it's red squirrels, I always like to know where they are. So yeah. So for North Wales, it's Clocaenog. That's COFNOD. And I suppose as well, talk to your friends and family about red squirrels. Let them know about the great work that's going on in Mid Wales and North Wales, and let them know that there's good projects going on to try and bring red squirrels back.
Brilliant. Thank you very much both for being such excellent speakers and having such an amazing amount of knowledge. And thanks very much to you all for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of Wales Nature Week. Join Caro if you can tomorrow to find out more. But until the next webinar, thank you everyone, and goodbye.
Bye.
Brilliant. Thank you everyone.